changing out my water pump. I noticed when I was doing my coolant system upgrade on my last video that I was getting noise from the bearings on the water pump. So what I've done is I wanted to go ahead and take care of that before it creates a problem. What I've done is I bought an Edelbrock water pump to replace it. It had really good reviews. The bearings are supposed to be upgraded and it's supposed to keep the engine a little bit cooler, so I figured it wouldn't hurt. So I'm going to be installing the Edelbrock water pump today. And if you've never installed a water pump on a small block Chevy, this is not a very complicated job. The first thing you have to do is drain the coolant, of course, because the radiator's full, and if you take the hose off the lower water pump hose, it's going to leak all your coolant out. So drain the coolant, and then we'll go from there. So the water pump that I've bought is a 8810, and it's a short water pump for small block Chevy. Some of the later models, they had longer shafts on them, or the pumps were longer, they stuck out further. But for this 65 model, we used the short one. And that's an 8810. And these are the parts that came with it. It came with new gaskets, bolts, and of course the water pump. So I'll have to take out the fittings that the hose is hooked to for the heater. So we'll have to remove those from my existing water pump and put on there also. Alright. So you can see here, going into the water pump, we have a lower radiator hose, and we have just one heater hose. We'll probably have to put a plug in that other hole. So we'll have to take off the fan again, take off the 4 bolts that hold the water pump on. There's 2 on each side. This is, like I said, this is not a very hard job. Chevy small block water pump is one of the easiest that I've ever worked on. And this one is on my engine is a 283, which they all bolt up the same. So I've already drained my coolant into a clean pot. I always use this clean pot, that way if my coolant's new and good, I'm going to just put it back in. And it is in this case. And you can see the little valve there, that's what you open up. You just twist it counterclockwise and it opens up and you can drain your radiator there. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove the fan. There's 4 bolts holding the fan on. They use a 1/2 wrench. So I'm going to take those off. They're kind of in an awkward spot. You can only use a wrench to get them off. And the spot these are in, you can't even get the ratchet wrench on there. So basically you just got to use an open end wrench. It would have been a great time to change this when I had the radiator out the other day, but at the time I didn't realize that my water pump bearings were starting to fail. So there, the fan come out, and I'll have to loosen up the bolts on these other belt tensioners. In my case, I got one on the alternator. So I can take the pulley off. In there I've slipped the pulley off. You see it sits on the end of the water pump. And I'll have to loosen these tensioners up some more when I get ready to install the new one, to put the belts back on. But you need a 9/16 socket to remove the bolts that hold the water pump on. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and remove these two hoses, because they're a lot easier to take off when they're held securely to the engine. And in my case, my two hose clamps are held on, or you can use a 5/16 nut driver to get the clamps loose. You can tell a lot more antifreeze is still in there. And you're still going to spill a little no matter how hard you try. Well, apparently I should have taken the radiator cap off and it may have drained down a little better. Still had a lot of antifreeze in there, it just wasn't coming out until I gave it a vent path. I'm going to also go ahead and remove this fitting while I've got the water pump mounted to the engine. It's hard to get a good angle on this fitting. I will tell you, you got to be careful when you're installing these, because the water pumps are made out of, and the Edelbrock is made out of cast aluminum, but the original ones are cast iron, and you can crack them, because I've done that before by putting too much pressure on them when I'm putting them in. They really only need to be snug tight. You don't have to bear down on them. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to get the hose removed from the water pump. So we got 9/16 head bolts on the water pump. Alright, so that's how easy it was to take the water pump off. So you can see the two water pumps side by side. The Edelbrock has an extra port on the top. I guess it's used for a different application than what I'm using. So I'm going to plug it off. One thing that's different about them is you can see the part that the pulley sits on. The one on the Edelbrock is significantly longer, which I like, because I'm using an aftermarket pulley, which is thicker than the original steel one. So that way you still got a long nipple that sticks off there to put for the fan to sit on. And I was kind of concerned about that on the other one. There's really no nipple for the fan to sit on. What that can cause is it to be off balance, and that will destroy the water pump really fast. So the new one has plenty of room for the aftermarket pulleys. Only one of the bolts are longer, at least the ones that come with the Edelbrock. Probably the originals too. You can see the big step up beside where the hose goes on in the side for the heater hose. And the other side's pretty much even. So they come with the new bolts. The long bolt obviously is going to go here. So it's important to make sure you clean up the mating surfaces where the gasket's going to seal at. And I always use RTV black or ultra black. It's supposed to be good chemical resistance and holds up to good temperature. I've never had any issues with it so far. So I'm going to coat both sides of my gaskets with Ultra Black from Permatex. Like I said, you got to make sure your mating surfaces are clean and dry. So scrape them off, dry them really well. Because if they're not dry, it'll cause problems potentially with your gaskets leaking. I really don't have a lot of problems with the gaskets leaking on these. I'm going to have to loosen the alternator bracket. Just to get it out of my way. I'll just take one bolt out and let it swing down. So I put a thin layer of RTV on both sides of the gaskets. I'm going to be really careful when I'm putting them down here. Alright, so you get all the bolts hand started, and then you tighten them down just snug, because they're going to end up torquing it to 30 foot-pounds. So you got to make sure you get the bolts on both bolts that hold on the alternator bracket. Make sure you get them started. Alright, so like I said, we're going to torque this down to 30 foot-pounds. Kind of bring them down evenly. It's not real critical to have a perfectly even torque pass, but you want to have everything snug down similar. You don't want to tighten down one all the way with the other still being fairly loose. Alright, so now we got the water pump torqued down evenly. We're going to put the heater hose in there, and also the plug that's in the top. And I've put Teflon tape on these. That's usually what I do, and it usually works pretty well. I just went ahead and got a ratchet. I'm only going to snug these. I don't want to take a chance on busting the water pump. If I need to tighten them anymore, I will, but I'll test it and see if it makes sure there's no leaks. When I get it up to pressure. So I'm going to make sure I tighten up the radiator hose now. And then we're going to put the pulley back on. Alright, so I got the belts roughly lined up. I'll have to loosen up the air conditioning one and before I complete the job. Now we're just going to put all the rest of the bolts back on. So now we're going to just go ahead and put all the rest of the belts back on. Then we're going to refill the radiator and we're pretty much done. So this is the way it looks after the final install. Everything back to normal, no leaks. I can't say that I saw a definite difference in temperature, but like I said, I needed a new water pump anyway. I was having bearing problems, and I don't have a temperature gauge on here that gives me exact numbers.